Letters Across the Sea by Oliver Hale. The evening sky turned a dusky rose as Eleanor Sinclair tucked a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear and peered through the window of her father's bookshop. London's Bloomsbury district had changed since the war began. Fewer people wandered the streets, and those who did moved with purpose, their faces set with determination that masked their fear. The blackout curtains were ready to be drawn at dusk, a reminder of the German bombers that regularly darkened the skies. Eleanor sighed and turned back to the stack of books that needed cataloging. Her father had left for his home guard duties, leaving her to mind the shop. At 22, she had hoped for more excitement in her life, perhaps university studies in literature or history. Instead, the war had arrived, bringing with it both limitations and unexpected possibilities. The bell above the door jingled, and Eleanor looked up, instantly straightening her simple navy dress. "I'm afraid we're closing soon," she began, then stopped abruptly. The American soldier who entered removed his cap, revealing a shock of sandy hair. His uniform was pressed and neat, though she could see the weariness in his posture, the slight slump of shoulders that had carried too much for too long. "Sorry, miss. I was just looking for something to read. Been stationed nearby, and the evenings get long." His accent was different from the Americans she'd encountered before, softer, with an almost musical quality. Eleanor found herself smiling. "Where are you from, if you don't mind my asking?" "Georgia, miss. Little town you've probably never heard of." He stepped further into the shop, extending his hand. "Lieutenant Daniel Hayes." "Eleanor Sinclair," she replied, taking his hand briefly. His palm was warm and calloused. "And we don't close for another 30 minutes. Perhaps I can help you find something?" Daniel's eyes, a striking shade of blue-gray, brightened. "I'd appreciate that. Been thinking about picking up some of your British authors. Something to help understand this place better." Eleanor led him toward the classics section. Dickens offers a fascinating glimpse of London, though from the previous century. "I've read Dickens," Daniel said, surprising her. "During my studies before the war. I was hoping for something newer." Eleanor paused, considering. "Perhaps Virginia Woolf? Or, if you prefer something less experimental, there's Evelyn Waugh." Daniel's fingers trailed along the spines of the books, pausing on a volume of poetry. "What about this?" Eleanor looked at his selection. T.S. Eliot? An excellent choice, though he was born American like yourself. But he became British, didn't he? Seems fitting for an American trying to understand Britain. Their eyes met, and Eleanor felt something flutter in her chest, a feeling both foreign and familiar, like remembering a place she'd never been. "That's quite insightful, Lieutenant Hayes." "Daniel, please." "Daniel." She tested the name, finding it pleasantly warm on her tongue. He purchased the book and lingered by the counter. "Would it be terribly forward of me to ask if you might join me for tea sometime? Tomorrow, perhaps?" Eleanor hesitated. She'd heard the warnings about American soldiers, overpaid, oversexed, and over here, as the saying went. But something about Daniel's gentle demeanor and thoughtful choice in literature intrigued her. "I take my lunch at 1 o'clock. There's a small cafe 2 doors down." Daniel's smile transformed his face, softening the lines that combat had etched around his eyes. "I'll be there at 1, then." After he left, Eleanor found herself moving through the closing routine with unusual energy, wondering what tomorrow might bring. The cafe was crowded with office workers and servicemen when Eleanor arrived the next day. She spotted Daniel immediately, seated at a small table near the window, his posture straight but not rigid. He stood when he saw her, the old-fashioned courtesy making her smile. "You came?" he said, pulling out her chair. "Did you think I wouldn't? War makes everything uncertain." The simple truth in his statement struck her. They ordered tea and sandwiches, simple fare in a time of rationing, and began the careful dance of getting acquainted. "What did you do before the war?" Eleanor asked. "I was studying literature at Emory University. Had dreams of becoming a professor." Daniel's expression turned wistful. "And you?" "I wanted to attend university as well, but then," she gestured vaguely, encompassing the war and all its disruptions. "The bookshop seems a fitting alternative." "It is. My father built it from nothing. He loves books almost more than people." Daniel chuckled. "And do you share that sentiment?" Eleanor considered this. "Books are more reliable, certainly. But people surprise you in ways books can't." They talked through lunch, discovering shared passions for poetry and history. Eleanor found herself captivated by Daniel's descriptions of Georgia, the sprawling oak trees draped with Spanish moss, the humid summer evenings, the scent of magnolias in bloom. "It sounds lovely," she said. "So different from London." "It is. But London has its own beauty. His eyes held hers. A resilience that's remarkable. When they parted, Daniel asked if he might see her again, and Eleanor agreed without hesitation. She returned to the bookshop lighter somehow, as if their conversation had temporarily lifted the weight of the war from her shoulders. Over the next few weeks, they met whenever Daniel's duties permitted. They explored London together, the parts that remained intact, untouched by the German bombs. Daniel marveled at the ancient buildings and winding streets, while Eleanor saw her city anew through his eyes. On a rare sunny afternoon, they walked through St. James's Park, watching children play and elderly couples sit peacefully on benches, momentary normality in the midst of global chaos. "How do you do it?" Daniel asked. "Live with such uncertainty day after day." Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I suppose we don't have a choice. Life continues even during war. Perhaps especially during war." They stopped near the lake, watching ducks glide across the surface. "In Georgia," Daniel said softly, "there's a tradition of writing letters to those you care for. Pages of thoughts and feelings that might be too difficult to express in person." "That sounds lovely," Eleanor replied, intrigued by this glimpse into his culture. "Would you allow me to write to you? Even though we're in the same city?" The request surprised her, but Eleanor found herself nodding. "I'd like that very much." The first letter arrived the next day, delivered by a fellow soldier to the bookshop. Eleanor waited until closing time to read it, savoring the anticipation. "Dear Eleanor, there are things I find difficult to say when looking into your eyes. Not because I don't wish to, but because words scatter like autumn leaves in a breeze when I'm near you. Before the war, I studied the great poets, believing I understood their meaning when they wrote of beauty and belonging. Now I realize I understood nothing until I walked into your bookshop. London has become more than a foreign posting to me. It has become the place where you are, and therefore the only place I wish to be. With admiration, Daniel." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. That night she wrote her reply by candlelight, the blackout curtains drawn against the darkness. "Dear Daniel, your letter touched me deeply. We English are often accused of reserve, and perhaps justly so. I find it easier to discuss Austen's prose than my own feelings. But your honesty deserves equal candor. These weeks of knowing you have been a gift amidst the hardship of war. When air raid sirens sound, I find myself thinking not of my own safety, but wondering if you are somewhere secure, somewhere safe. Is it strange that in a time of such uncertainty, I have never felt more sure of anything than the joy I feel in your company? Yours, Eleanor." Their letter writing continued alongside their meetings, creating a dual relationship, one of spoken conversations over tea and walks through bomb-damaged streets, and another of written words that delved deeper into their hopes and fears. In his letters, Daniel revealed the terrors he'd witnessed in combat before being reassigned to London, the friends lost, the innocents abandoned. Eleanor shared her fears for her father, who insisted on fire watching during air raids, and her guilt at finding happiness amid such widespread suffering. Summer faded into autumn, and their connection deepened. Daniel began spending his free evenings at the bookshop, helping Eleanor with inventory or simply reading quietly while she worked. Mr. Sinclair, initially suspicious of the American soldier, gradually warmed to him after discovering Daniel's extensive knowledge of literature and genuine respect for books. One evening, as they closed the shop together, Daniel seemed unusually quiet. "Is something troubling you?" Eleanor asked, sensing his distraction. Daniel hesitated before answering. "I received new orders today. I'm being transferred to a unit preparing for something big. Can't say what exactly, but..." Eleanor felt as though the floor had tilted beneath her feet. She had known this might come. Nothing in wartime was permanent, but the reality struck hard. "When do you leave?" 3 days. His voice was barely audible. Eleanor nodded, fighting to maintain her composure. "Then we shall make the most of them." The following days took on the quality of a dream, both heightened and unreal. They visited the National Gallery, where paintings had been returned from their wartime storage. They had dinner at a small restaurant where the owner, a friend of Eleanor's father, managed to procure a bottle of pre-war wine for them. On Daniel's final evening in London, they walked along the Thames as the sun set, casting long shadows across the water. "I have something for you," Daniel said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. Eleanor unwrapped it carefully to reveal a slender volume of T.S. Eliot's 4 Quartets. "Open it," Daniel urged gently. Inside the cover he had written, "Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future. Until we meet again, all my love, Daniel." Eleanor traced the words with her fingertip. "It's perfect. she whispered, unable to say more past the tightness in her throat. Daniel took her hand, his touch warm despite the autumn chill. "I'll write to you, as often as I can. And I'll be here, waiting for your letters." Eleanor met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away despite the tears threatening to spill. He kissed her then, a gentle press of lips that held both promise and farewell. Eleanor closed her eyes, memorizing the moment, the distant sound of the river, the slight scent of his military-issue soap, the solid warmth of him against the gathering evening cold. When they parted, Daniel pressed his forehead to hers. "This isn't an ending, Eleanor. I promise you that." True to his word, Daniel's letters continued to arrive, though less frequently and heavily censored by military officials. Eleanor learned to read between the blacked-out lines, gathering that he was involved in preparations for a major offensive. Winter descended on London, bringing bitter cold and fuel shortages. Eleanor wore layers of clothing in the bookshop, where customers were increasingly rare. Yet she maintained the routine, opening each day with stubborn determination that her father both understood and shared. "Your American writes beautiful letters," Mr. Sinclair commented one evening as they huddled near their small heater, both reading by lamplight. Daniel had taken to including snippets of poetry or literary references that he knew would pass the censors, private messages that only Eleanor would understand. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, surprised by her father's observation. "He does. When this war ends, and it will end, my dear, you should consider going to America. Seeing those magnolias he describes so vividly." Eleanor looked up, startled by the suggestion. "Would you be terribly upset if I did?" Mr. Sinclair's smile was tinged with sadness. "I want you to live, Eleanor, not just survive, as we're all doing now. When peace comes, grasp it with both hands and don't let go." The conversation stayed with Eleanor as weeks turned to months and winter reluctantly gave way to spring. Daniel's letters spoke increasingly of the future, of introducing her to his family in Georgia, of showing her the university where he'd studied, of building something meaningful from the ruins of war. Then, in June 1944, the letters stopped. Eleanor heard the news of the Allied invasion of Normandy with a mixture of hope and dread, knowing Daniel was likely among the thousands of troops landing on French beaches. Each day that passed without word from him stretched her nerves tighter. She continued working in the bookshop, continued writing to him, though she had no address to send the letters. At night, she reread his previous correspondence, searching for comfort in his familiar handwriting. "He's a survivor," her father reassured her. "You can see it in his eyes." 2 weeks after D-Day, a young soldier appeared at the bookshop door, his uniform crisp despite the summer heat. Eleanor's heart stuttered in her chest. "Miss Sinclair?" he asked, removing his cap. "Yes," the word barely escaped her lips. "Lieutenant Hayes asked me to deliver this personally." He handed her an envelope, slightly crumpled and stained with what might have been mud or something worse. "He wanted you to know he's alive, but wounded. Being transported back to England. He'd have come himself, but..." The soldier gestured vaguely. Eleanor accepted the letter with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. "Is he? Will he recover?" "Yes, ma'am. Not serious enough to send him home to America. He'll mend." After the soldier left, Eleanor opened the letter, her eyes drinking in Daniel's handwriting, more jagged than usual but unmistakably his. "My dearest Eleanor, I am writing this from a field hospital in France. Please don't worry, I've sustained injuries that look worse than they are. A piece of shrapnel caught me in the leg, and I have some minor burns. The doctors assure me I'll walk without difficulty once healed. In those moments on the beach, with chaos all around, it was thoughts of you that kept me moving forward. The promise of returning to you, of continuing what we've begun. I'll be transported to a hospital near London within days. The military works quickly when it comes to patching up soldiers. They want us back in the fight as soon as possible, but they've promised me convalescent leave once I'm stable. Until I see you again, I carry your last letter close to my chest, where it has remarkably remained dry despite everything. All my love, Daniel." The hospital was crowded with wounded men, their beds lined in neat rows across what had once been a school gymnasium. Eleanor navigated between them, following a nurse's directions until she spotted Daniel near a window, his leg elevated and bandaged. He looked thinner, his face more angular, but his eyes, those blue-gray eyes that had first captured her attention, brightened when he saw her. "Eleanor." Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. She reached for his hand, careful not to disturb the bandages on his arm. "I came as soon as they would let me." "You're more beautiful than I remembered," he said softly. "And I remembered you as very beautiful indeed." Eleanor smiled through tears. "And you're more charming than I remembered, Lieutenant Hayes." They talked for hours, his voice occasionally dropping with fatigue but always rallying. He told her of the landing, not the gruesome details but enough for her to understand what he'd endured. She told him of London's continued resilience, of the flying bombs that had recently begun terrorizing the city, of her father's unwavering spirit. When visiting hours ended, Eleanor reluctantly stood to leave, but Daniel tightened his grip on her hand. "I've had time to think, lying here," he said, his expression serious. "About what matters. About what I want when this is all over." Eleanor's breath caught. "And what is that?" "You," he said simply. "A life with you, whether in London or Georgia or anywhere else we choose. I know it's not the most romantic proposal." "Yes," Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, Daniel, anywhere." A nurse approached, gently reminding Eleanor that she needed to leave. Before she went, Daniel pressed something into her palm, a simple band fashioned from what appeared to be a piece of silver metal. "Made it during the crossing to Normandy," he explained. "From a coin. It's temporary, until I can give you a proper ring, but—" Eleanor slipped it onto her finger. "It's perfect." The wedding took place 3 months later in the small church near the bookshop, much of it rebuilt after bomb damage. London was still under attack from V2 rockets, but the war was turning decisively in the Allies' favor, and hope had begun to replace desperation in the faces of those who gathered to celebrate. Daniel stood tall despite the cane he still used, his uniform decorated with newly awarded medals he'd been embarrassed to receive. Eleanor wore a dress fashioned from parachute silk by a local seamstress, an extravagance in a time of strict rationing, but one her father had insisted upon. "Books and love," Mr. Sinclair said during his toast at the modest reception held in the bookshop. "These are the things that sustain us, that remind us of our humanity even in our darkest hours. My daughter found both within these walls, and for that I am eternally grateful." Later, as they shared their first dance among the bookshelves, Daniel whispered in Eleanor's ear, "I have a surprise." "What's that?" "I've been offered a teaching position at Oxford. They're planning for after the war, recruiting American scholars to strengthen international relations." He watched her reaction carefully. "We wouldn't have to choose between England and America. We could have both." Eleanor's face lit with joy. "That sounds perfect." She glanced around at the bookshop, at her father chatting animatedly with Daniel's commanding officer. "We could even open a bookshop of our own someday, a sibling to this one." "I'd like that," Daniel said, his arms tightening around her waist. "Our own chapter in a continuing story." Outside, the sounds of London continued, distant traffic, occasional military vehicles, people going about their lives amid a city wounded but unbowed. Inside, surrounded by books and well-wishers, Eleanor and Daniel danced slowly, their movements a promise of all the dances to come in the years ahead, when the letters they'd exchanged would be bound and preserved alongside the many volumes of their shared life.